Hi there. I want to go through some Section A questions on the legal system and lawmaking. So this is the Section A of papers 1 and 2. The Section A of paper 3 is slightly different, so we'll talk about that in a different video. So Section A, you should be spending about 30 minutes on this out of your 2 hours on the exam. You'll have to answer 2 questions, which are 25 marks in total. So 25 marks in 30 minutes. You will have a choice of 2 questions for each part, so you can choose the area of your strength. You will be given a choice of 2 describe questions and a choice of 2 discuss questions. The topics have generally been related, but you don't have to answer the same topic on both. So you can mix and match, so you can do whichever one you want of the describe and whichever you want of the discuss. Describe is AO1. It requires you to show your knowledge and understanding of that topic. AO3 is evaluation. It requires you to look at the advantages and disadvantages of the theme in question. You do not need a conclusion for Section A. If a question needs a conclusion, it has an asterisk next to it. This doesn't. So don't waste your time writing a conclusion. So what do you need to do, and how can we revise effectively to answer these questions? So AO1 is very simply factual knowledge. And there's no easy way to learn it apart from repetition, repetition, repetition. Our memory works on recall and repetition. Think of the things that you know best, your family's names, where you live. It's because you interact with those things regularly. So, when it comes to learning, my advice is to make lists. Try and limit yourself to 10, 12 at a push. I would try and not do any more than that. I would make a list of the 10 facts that you need to learn about a particular part of a topic. And if you can, use colours and doodles. So as you can see here, if I was doing jury selection, for example, we have someone getting a letter, we have the electoral register, we have people who may not want to do it, we have the fact that you have to have been living in the UK for at least 5 years since your 13th birthday, that's a little birthday cake, and the disqualifications, for example. Now, if you can do those doodles, and as you can see, I'm not very good at drawing, you don't have to be, and if you can do them in colour, those things help encode the information into your memory better. We associate through these things. If you want to aim high, if you want to be getting those A stars, A, B grades, then these are the sorts of things that you also need to be including in your answer. Examples of statistics. So for example, if you're talking about judges, what percentage of men, what percentage of women, what is the ethnic makeup of judges? Give some case examples. This is especially important in the lawmaking topic when you're talking about things like precedent or statutory interpretation or law reform. And act examples. Of course, if you're talking about the legislative process, we should be given examples of acts. Think of examples and statistics as the icing on top of your cake. It makes it better, but it's not the main thing that you need. The main thing you need is the information. There's no clever way of writing, and in fact, students often get themselves into a tizzy if they try and write that way. Just give me the facts. I sometimes unpleasantly call it factual vomit. Just write everything on the page you can think of relating to that. But if you make lists, your brain will learn them in a certain order. So hopefully if you remember 1, that will lead you to remember 2, and that'll lead you to remember 3, and so on and so forth. The pictures will also help. Another little tip is when you're creating and when you're reading back through, try and listen to one particular song. Create a playlist of the songs that you've learned, and as you're revising, listen to that playlist as well. All of these things help your memory grab onto that information better and learn it. Now, a really good revision tip is to read through your list, give yourself a few moments, then cover it up. Take 1 colour pen, set a timer, and then write down as many of the points as you can remember without looking at the list. Then, after the time is finished, look back over your list and in a second colour, add in anything that you've got. Those are your hotspots, so I recommend that you write in red if you can. Those are the things that your brain is struggling to recall, and those are the things that you need to focus your revision on. I think it's a common student mistake, and I've done it certainly, where you try and revise the things you already know. Your brain doesn't need help with those things. You can also do this with mark schemes and check it against mark schemes of what you've done. So a really good revision tip is just to keep writing the information out. Your actual answer is just these points in sentences. So for jury selection, if the question is how is the jury selected, you would simply say a person receives a letter called a jury summons. A person must be on the electoral register. A person must have lived in the UK for at least 5 years since their 13th birthday. You cannot defer or excuse without good excuse. These may be, and you may be disqualified from being selected. The reasons for this would be. So you're just writing out in sentences. So a list of key phrases to help you remember that you can expand later on. When it comes to AO3 follows a simple structure, and my advice is to repeat this structure as many times as you can within about 20 minutes or so. I'd recommend spending about 10 minutes on the first part, the describe question, and about 20 on the discuss. So what the examiner is looking for is you making a point. That point is then developed, and then finally it is extended. A level 4 excellent response needs a wide range of extended points. And you might see this in your marked essays. PDE, point developed extended. So how should we structure our essays? First thing, it's really important to read the question. Does it ask you to discuss advantages and disadvantages? Or does it ask you to focus just on one? Discuss the drawbacks of something. Now, it's still okay to put the opposing side, but what's really important is what you're starting your paragraphs with. So if it's discuss the advantages and disadvantages, it's okay to do half-half. So maybe start half your paragraphs with a good point, half your paragraphs with a negative. However, if it's just one, so discuss the positives of, discuss the benefits of, discuss why we have this, all of your paragraphs must start with that. So it must start with the benefits, but you can counter with any negatives you've learned. But any paragraphs that start with a negative won't be marked, so just be aware of that. So the simple structure, and I love to see this as an examiner because it's easy for me to mark, it's easy for me to award you points. One advantage or disadvantage is, or based on the wording of the question, one benefit is, one drawback is, and remember, start your paragraph with whatever the question dictates to you. That gives you a point. So for example, when it comes to juries, one advantage is that they are chosen at random. That's a point. Development is then explaining that with as much detail as possible. Why is that good or bad? So one advantage is that juries are chosen at random. This is good because this means that a cross-section of people in society should be represented, and those people shouldn't suffer from any sort of case-hardened bias like magistrates are sometimes accused of. That's development, that's explaining your point. And this is a really good place to put in some examples. Finally, extension. Now you can extend it with furthermore. The point must build on. It's easier to give however, and I love seeing this word in an essay because that tells me some extension might be coming. Now, really key point, the extension must be somewhere related to your point. You can't have two separate points, otherwise they will be classed as two separate points. Now, you could extend with a counter argument. I think that's the easiest to do. A counter example, or a counter case act, or a further example, a further case or act, which supports your point. So for example, I would need to say something like, one advantage of juries is that they're chosen at random, point. This is good because it means that we have a cross-section of people represented, so we can get a wide variety of views and it avoids people becoming case hardened. Develop. However, there are lots of people who won't get chosen because they aren't on the electoral register, such as homeless people, for example. And therefore, this might mean that it's not as representative. Extension. Notice how my however was linked to the point before. So if I was to say, one advantage is that juries are selected at random. This is good because they're representative. However, they make their decision in secret, so it's really hard to appeal. That's nothing to do with my further points. So that would be a separate point, and it's not as sophisticated, it's not as high level, and it's not going to get you as many marks in the exam. So you revise this the same. Use acronyms. So for example, I often use PEGD and QUIT to help me remember some of the advantages and disadvantages. But to be honest, if you can remember the AO1, we should be able to go through and critique some of those. And it's just a case of practice. Now, what sort of things should you be revising? I've tried to break down, hope you can see this okay. I've tried to break down the key topics that you'll come across in the legal system. Now, the legal system is the biggest one. And I think there is about 30 things that you can talk about here. So we have, and I've grouped them in colour by topic, work of civil courts, civil pre-trial, civil appeals, tribunals and ADR or ODR, so other ways of resolving disputes. In criminal, you might talk about bail, the work of the different criminal courts, so the classifications of the different offences, so the difference between summary, triable, either way, indictable, and what happens pre-trial. How do we decide which court they go to? And the system of criminal appeals. The aims of sentence, the different types of sentencing that you can be given, and aggravating and mitigating factors. When it comes to lay people, talk about magistrates. What do they need to become a magistrate and how are they chosen, and what do they do? Same thing with juries. What qualifications, how do you get chosen, and what do they do when they're in the courtroom? Legal professionals, barristers, how do you become one? What's the process and what do they do? Same with solicitors, how do you become one? What do they do? Legal executives, you could do one on its own. And then regulation, what is the complaints procedure for all of those you could do in one? Judges can be tricky, but it's just a case of learning facts. What are the different types of judges? How do you become them? What are the work of judges? So I would split that into criminal judges, civil court judges, and appeal judges. How do you become a judge? And how are you dismissed, including training, so that whole process. And then talking about separation of powers and the independence of judges. It's also a really good one if you do politics, I think. Then finally, when it comes to funding, these are going to be a bit shorter, I think. Government criminal funding. So if you're accused of a crime, how do you get a lawyer? Government civil funding, if you want to sue somebody. Sources of private funding. So that includes something called conditional fee agreements. And other sources of advice, free advice, like the Citizens Advice Bureau. So that is kind of the whole of legal system put together. There's 30 there, which sounds overwhelming. But my advice is to get a piece of A4 paper, fold it into three columns, write your lists. Do it on the back as well. And then you should only need 5 sheets of paper, and that's the whole of legal system on a page. But what about lawmaking?